Scholastic Audio presents Spirit Animals, Book 4, Fire and Ice, by Shannon Hale. Read for you by Nicola Barber. Chapter 1. Gerathon. Gerathon moved. Her black scales, thick as plate metal, clicked against the sandstone. Her mouth was open, tasting the air. Her tail flicked playfully behind her. Life. She thrilled with life, with her own body sliding over Earth, and the Earth sliding under her. Life is a pulse, a twitch, a flutter, an inhale. Life is movement. She wagged her tongue and tasted human on the breeze. More life. She wasn't hungry at the moment. Flocks of animals skittered, lumbered, and scampered after her, trembling with fear, yet unable to turn away. Any time she wanted a snack, she simply extended her great neck and snatched up a kangaroo or wild dog. She had not known hunger since her escape. All the same, life filled her with the desire to grab pulsing things and squeeze. She changed directions toward the lone human, her weaving body frisky. She could move nearly silently, of course, but there was no need. What creature could outrun 2 tons of cobra? This creature did try. A young man, his face still full of childhood when he looked back at her with wide-eyed fear. She hissed, a happy kind of giggle, and buzzed with the strength of her muscles and long, strong body. She spread the elegant hood of skin on her neck, coiled, and sprang. Life. This life between her jaws thrashed, kicked, his heartbeat galloping against her tongue. He screamed heartily as her fangs pressed into his back and her thick, black venom oozed inside him. His heart graciously pumped the venom along with his own blood throughout his body. He twitched for a time before going limp. But his heart was still beating, slow and lovely, as she swallowed him whole, her fantastic muscles pulling him foot by foot through her soft pink mouth into the final darkness of her belly. She curled up and rested in the hot coral sands, enjoying the sensation of that second heartbeat beside her own, another life inside her, slowly dying by her own power. She laughed now to remember how she had raged and seethed for centuries beneath her prison of rocks and dirt, the weight trying to crush life, swallow movement, end her. But new freedom made everything more delicious. Warm with sunlight and fresh food, she felt giddy and just a bit mischievous. She couldn't possibly eat another thing, yet her hunger for life was only piqued. Her yellow eyes turned white as she reached out with her mind. Many white spots of heat vibrated behind her eyes, each one representing a person, all known to Gerathon, as a shepherd knows her sheep. Gerathon chose a sleeper, easier to slip into the unconscious ones. This was a woman, elderly by human standards, living far away in Nilo. Gerathon's consciousness filled the woman's mind like sand fills a jar. She made her stand, leave her little house and look around. Night in Nilo was brown and warm, scented with jasmine. Gerathon could almost feel the crack of dry grass beneath the woman's bare feet, the soil still holding heat from that day's sun. Through the woman's eyes, Gerathon saw a cliff ahead. She moved her toward it, faster, faster, running now. The woman flinched then, as if trying to wake up. Gerathon hissed pleasantly. Life is movement. She moved the woman over the edge and fell with her, abandoning the woman's consciousness a moment before she hit the canyon floor. A waste, perhaps, considering Garathan's plans for the future. But she needed to collect all the talismans first anyway, and in the meantime, a great beast deserves to play. She licked the wind. The curl of her scaly mouth was always smiling. Chapter 2. Theft. The wind was blowing from the south, pushing against Maylin's back, urging her on. Not that she needed any urging. Lately, fire seemed to rage inside her, flaring and snapping, insisting she move forward. The others sometimes complained about the endless travel and relentless pace through Zhong and now northern Yura. But in Maylin's opinion, they couldn't move quickly enough. Sunlight flared against the roadside river, and Maylin squeezed her eyes shut. As always, the same images were waiting for her behind her eyelids. The great crocodile, jaws open, eyes deepest black. Her father still gone. Maylin quickly opened her eyes and heeled her horse into a faster trot. The wind shifted. A breeze from the northwest rolled over her face. She rubbed the goosebumps prickling on her arms. "It's going to get a lot colder," Roland said, trotting his horse up beside her. "Unfriendly cold. Bite your nose off and bully your toes cold." "Yes," she said. "I once saw a fellow lousy, good-for-nothing street kid dare a rich kid to lick an iron lamppost in the dead of winter. The rich kid's tongue stuck there, just frozen stuck, while the street kid robbed him of his coat and shoes." "You don't say," said Maylin. "Ah, but I do say, my lady Panda." "And I don't suppose the street kid in your story had a name that begins with R and ends with N?" "Certainly not. I was never lousy. And I only tell you this story as a warning because, you know, you do have that unfortunate habit of licking lampposts." Maylin almost smiled. Ever since the battle at Dinesh's temple, Roland had spent a lot of time near her, saying ridiculous things more often than not, trying to distract her from her grief, she assumed. Their journey for the great elephant's talisman had been the most costly one yet. Striking out alone, Maylin had finally found her father, leading an embattled resistance from within Zhong's great bamboo maze. Then, almost as soon as she'd found him, he was gone, killed before her very eyes. At first, Maylin had felt quiet, numb. It was an awful emptiness, like she had nothing left to give. But then, slowly, a heat began to kindle. A fire burned inside her, reminding her that somewhere the devourer was free and killing. Maylin wouldn't let sympathy or silly jokes put this fire out. She kicked her horse even faster. "Crossroads ahead," Tariq announced. "Let's stop for the night." "But there's still a little daylight left," said Maylin. "The river veers away from our path at the crossroads," said Tariq. "We need to water the horses before we continue on north." Maylin wanted to complain, but Tariq was looking at her again with understanding and sympathy. G often gave her the same understanding and sympathetic look, which was why she kept G in passive state as often as possible. It was becoming unbearable. The next person who looked at her with understanding and sympathy was going to get... "Maylin," said Abeka. "What?" Maylin snapped. "Oh," said Abeka, starting back. I was just going to ask you if you wanted to help me gather firewood." "Yes, I do," Maylin said forcefully. The flat ground around the crossroads was filling up, travellers and trader caravans setting up camp for the night. Their team was travelling up a flat, grassy expanse of northern Yura. It was nowhere near Glengavin, sadly, or Finn, but the road was quiet and safe for once. There was even a minstrel troupe, a lute player strumming, a woman in a blue veil singing softly as if rehearsing. Abeka didn't talk as they scavenged driftwood and broken branches from the riverbank. Good. Silence allowed Maylin to focus entirely on the burning inside, her whole being tuned to the idea of the devourer, as if she were an arrow point and he the target. With armloads of wood, they headed to where Tariq, Rolan and Connor were unsaddling the horses. Laying stones into a circle for the fire pit was the ginger-haired Yoran Greencloak Maya, whom Tariq had asked to join them on their quest back to the north. She was older than Maylin by a handful of years, but her small, pale face beneath her abundant, curly red hair could be mistaken for someone younger. Maya pushed up the sleeve of her purple sweater, exposing a small, lizard-shaped tattoo on her forearm. With a burst of light, her fire salamander emerged from passive state and scurried up her shoulder. The black salamander bore bright yellow spots all over its body and was small enough to curl up in her palm. Maylin smiled sadly at Maya, certain the girl had been disappointed in her spirit animal, as Maylin had been with her panda. A salamander couldn't possibly lend any useful talents in battle. Maylin and Abeka unloaded their wood, Abeka dumping some into the fire pit. Maylin was about to correct her. To start a fire, they needed smaller pieces of kindling first, and then... Maya lifted her hand, and a ball of fire formed above her palm. She blew, and the fire shot into the wood, seizing the whole bundle in instant flames. "Oh," said Maylin.
"Hadn't you seen Maya's trick before?"
asked Connor. Maylin shook her head. "I'm not much of a fighter, I'm afraid," said Maya with a generous smile. "I've got the one trick, and that's about all I'm good for."
"That one trick might be indispensable for us in the icy north," said Tariq.
The veiled singer paced by. She and her lute-playing partner were on their way to the water. "You're heading north?" she asked.
"Whatever for? Nothing is north of here but cold, more cold, and then really, really cold." "And walruses," said Rolan. "I'm determined to see a walrus, if they're actually real." "Rolan, I've told you," said Tariq. "I've seen them with my own eyes." "Finned, legless elephants," said Rolan. "I'll believe it when I see it."
"We're headed to Samis," Abeka said to the minstrels. "Have you been there?"
"Oh, Samis, that's right," said the lute player. "I'd almost forgotten there was any town between here and Arctica. No one bothers to go to Samis."
"We tried once years ago, didn't we, my love?" said the veiled woman, holding her partner's hand and twirling around him. "Traders warned us that Samis turns away all visitors, but surely they're starved for entertainment, we said. So up we rode."
"And can you guess?" said the lute player. "Turned away at the town gate."
He played a chord on his lute, as if announcing the end of a song. The pair danced off. "No traders?" said Abeka. Uraza lay beside her, stretched out, and Abeka petted the leopard thoughtfully, evoking a bone-rattling purr. "In my village, without traders, we'd have no metal goods, no pots and pans, shovels, anything like that. If we purchase some metal items here to give to the people of Samis, maybe we can get in their good graces." Tariq nodded.
"A fine idea."
He removed a few coins from his purse and gave them to Abeka. She left to shop for the gifts, Uraza padding behind her. A few minutes later, Maylin heard angry shouts from across the camp. She stood, lifting her arm to call out G, but resisted the urge. "Are Abeka and Uraza still out there?" Maylin asked.
"Stay here,"
said Tariq, running toward the noise. But that fire was burning in Maylin, and she couldn't sit still. She raced after Tariq, Rolan following. leaving Connor and Maya to tend the fire and watch their things. In the centre of camp, 2 men rolled around in the dirt, throwing punches and yanking hair. Tariq's spirit animal, the otter Lumio, rode on his shoulder. With his abilities enhanced, Tariq dove into the fight as easily as an otter into water and separated the men.
"Enough,"
Tariq said, and the catcalls and shouts died out.
"What's going on here?" "He robbed me!"
The speaker was a stout, bald man. His nose was bleeding, his shirt torn.
"I'd been saving up for years now, a coin here, a coin there. I almost had enough to take home, get my mother out of that dirty city, buy her a farm in the country. Almost had it, till he cut the purse from my belt."
He lifted the corner of his shirt, showing the cut ends of 2 leather straps still tied to his belt.
"I'm telling you, it wasn't me," said the other. "Bill, I've travelled with you for years. Why would I rob you now?" "I don't know, but you're the only one I told about it, and if you didn't take it, where'd it go?"
said Bill. He sat back in the dirt, crying into his hands.
"I saved for so long." "Sir, your friend is telling the truth," said Roland. "He didn't rob you."
Maylin glanced at Roland. Essex was circling the sky nearby. In the past, she had to be touching Roland to enhance his intuition. Perhaps the bond between the boy and his gerfalcon was improving at last, though Maylin had still never seen Essex take the passive form. The one called Bill looked up, his dirty face streaked with despair.
"Then who did?"
Roland scanned the crowd of traders, musicians, and travellers who had gathered to watch the fight. A curious hush fell over the group. Roland's eyes stopped on one lanky young man wearing a crisp white shirt and cravat who was inspecting a wagon wheel, his back to the fight. Roland's brows narrowed.
"I'd check Fancy Pants over there," said Roland, nodding in the man's direction.
Tariq grabbed the lanky man's arms, holding them behind his back.
"What are you doing?"
Fancy Pants shouted.
"I mean, that is a stunning wagon wheel," said Roland, "but maybe not quite fascinating enough to pull your attention from a camp brawl, unless you're just trying not to be noticed."
Maylin and another trader patted him down. Maylin felt a bulge in his boot and reached in, pulling out a leather sack heavy with coins, its strings cut. She tossed the bag to Roland. The man struggled, cursing. Maylin stood, her hands in eager fists. That fire inside her flared, threatening to burn her if she did not strike a blow, take down the devourer and all his followers. Perhaps this petty thief would do for now. But Tariq held him tight, and Maylin exhaled, letting her fists relax. Roland held the bag up to the man's cut strings.
"That looks like a match to me," said Roland.
Roland handed Bill the purse.
"Thank you,"
Bill whispered, clutching it to his chest.
"At the last crossroads, someone was robbed too,"
said an older woman with pulled-back white hair and rough riding clothes.
"That was you as well, wasn't it, Jarak?"
The man called Jarak just thrashed in Tariq's iron grip.
"Traders have a code," said the woman. "You broke it. Jarak, you are banished from this caravan and from ever trading in the north."
Jarak looked as if he would speak, but a dozen traders moved in behind the woman, some with folded arms, some bearing weapons. Tariq let him go. Jarak cursed, grabbed a pack from his wagon, and ran off into the night. When Maylin and Roland walked back to camp, Bill and his friend were shaking hands.
"Nothing like a robbery and caravan scuffle to get you warmed up for supper," said Roland.
Maylin slowed her steps so she could walk beside him. She opened her mouth, readying a retort, something that might make Roland laugh
or fire back, start a conversation that would keep them talking for hours. But instead of words in her throat, she felt only searing heat. Anxious, needy. She picked up the pace, leaving him behind as she neared their camp. Up ahead, she saw Connor lying back against his wolf, Briggan, petting his head. Maya was on her stomach, holding her fire salamander, Teeny, on her palm, and talking earnestly. All green cloaks spoke to their spirit animals, but Maya was holding what appeared to be an intense, one-sided conversation with an amphibian. Perhaps she was mad, but she seemed so content, at ease. Everything Mei Lin was not. Perhaps Ji could help. No. Mei Lin clenched her fists, refusing the thought. Ji would calm her down. But Mei Lin didn't want peace. She wanted a fight. The rage in her flared hotter, scalding her chest, her throat. She pressed her eyes shut to keep from crying, and saw the image again. Her father, still, his eyes vacant. A sob hit her throat like a fist. She opened her eyes and released Ji. The panda landed on the ground, turned and looked at her. As always, Mei Lin thought the panda looked comical. Black limbs over a white body like ill-fitting clothes. The black rings around her eyes drooped down as if sad. Everything about the beast was round and cuddly. Mei Lin wanted to be angry yet again that she hadn't bonded with a predator, fierce and battle-ready. But Ji's silver eyes stared at her, intent. Mei Lin returned the gaze, took a breath, and suddenly everything seemed to slow. Mei Lin became aware of the cool breeze against the hairs of her arms, of the rich, velvety blue of the evening sky. Sounds seemed to break apart, and she could easily separate voices from the rushing of the river, the many conversations at camp pulling apart into their own pieces, the footfalls from Roland coming up behind her, and, just beyond him, faster footfalls, running. She turned. Time wasn't really slowed. Wrapped in Ji's peace, her perception of the moment was so intense the world just seemed slow. Roland smiled at her. "What?" he asked. He couldn't see. Jarak was running at Roland's back and he was holding a long, curved knife. "Roland!" Mei Lin shouted. The calm from Ji still surrounded her. Before Roland even had a chance to turn and look, Mei Lin noticed a rock by her foot, kicked it into her hand, and threw, striking Jarak in the shoulder. Startled, Roland took a step back, inches from Jarak's knife. By then Mei Lin was already in motion, running forward. She slid the rest of the way, knocking her feet into Jarak's legs, sending him off balance. She could see from the way he moved that he had no martial training, but he had plenty of rage and a very large knife. He wasn't going to give up. He swiped. Mei Lin seemed to see the arc of the knife's trajectory as if it were drawn in the air, slowly nearing her neck. She dodged easily, leaning to deliver a kidney punch. Jarak doubled over and then swiped again. This time she punched his sternum, knocking the wind from him, then made a sharp cut with the edge of her hand against his arm. He dropped the knife. Holding his wrist, he looked at her, eyes afraid. He turned and ran away. Roland was staring at her with absolute surprise. The wave of calm emanating from Ji dissipated, and time seemed to click forward again at its natural pace. "You were moving so fast," he said. "How did you do that?" "I didn't feel fast," she said. "Everything else just seemed slow." Roland frowned. "I'm sorry, Roland," said Mei Lin. "You probably think I'm bossy and pushy,
and you could have handled him yourself, and I shouldn't interfere all the time and—
Maylin,
he said. She realised he'd been saying her name over and over.
Maylin, thank you.
You're welcome, she said, and started to turn.
No, I mean it.
Roland hesitated.
On the streets, I was always part of a crew, but if one of my crew had to choose between me and a hot meal, well, I knew which way he'd go. But here with you guys, for the first time, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I trust you. And for me, that's a big deal.
He smiled that Roland smile that she was coming to know so well. At first he'd just been some orphan boy to her, and now here she was, standing before him, an orphan herself, mother dead birthing her, father killed by the devourer, homeless, nowhere to return to, just trying to survive. More like him than she'd ever imagined possible. His brown eyes were warm, his brown skin speckled with dirt from the road, his broad face comfortingly familiar. Inside the great void of despair that had filled her since her father's death, she felt a pinprick of hope. And then Roland reached out and took her hand. His fingers were warm. Maylin had never been so aware of the beating of her heart. Chapter 3. Samis. The road to Samis began to lose its roadness. Grasses and brambles reclaimed the hard dirt, and Connor was confident they were actually headed somewhere only because Tariq had a map to follow. Before he saw any sign of the village, Connor spotted a herd of caribou. The grey-coated, big-antlered animals grazed a green countryside, watched over by two shepherds, said Connor, or caribou herders anyway. I'd like to go talk to them.
Sure, said Roland. Have at it. Just, don't give them the slate elephant or granite ram. I mean, if you can help it.
Roland, Tariq said quietly. Roland shrugged, unconcerned at the rebuke. Connor felt sick. He'd been foolish to hope that the others had forgotten how he'd given the iron boar talisman over to the enemy in exchange for the safety of his family. Not forgotten or forgiven. Connor pretended not to hear and just walked on. Two young men were sitting on the grass, chatting in the shade of a lone tree in a patch of pink and lavender lupines. Connor carried a shepherd's crook with him on this journey back in Ura. He knew it would likely serve little purpose beyond a walking stick, as there had been precious few sheep to herd on their quests. But the thick wood staff felt right in his fist, its heft as familiar as the smell of wood smoke in the hearth at home. The pine sap crackling, his mother's bread baking. After the frightening battle in Zhong and the whole iron boar business, a crook in his fist was comforting, even if it meant never using the crook for its intended purpose. Now, though, he raised the staff high as he approached, hoping to greet the herders as colleagues. He expected a wave in return, maybe a hello, perhaps an invitation to join their shade. Instead, they jumped to their feet, looking cautious. Both were blonde and fair, and looked to be 20 years old or nearly so. Their dark blue jackets and brown trousers seemed clean and unworn, perfectly fitting their broad athletic builds. No herders Connor knew wore clothes so fine. "Hello," said Connor. "My name is Connor, and I'm a shepherd myself, or I was until I joined up with my Greencloak companions there. My family kept sheep in central Ura. You're watching caribou? I've never seen a herd of domestic caribou before."
"We don't see visitors to Samis,"
said one. "Never," said the other. "We won't be staying long," said Connor. "Do you ever keep sheep, or just caribou?" The herders glanced at each other, but didn't answer. Connor was aware of his teammates behind him, waiting for him to form some kind of herder bond with these strangers.
He sighed at himself and kept at it. Though the herders rarely spoke a word, Connor went on about sheep, the different breeds, asking in-depth questions about caribou eating and sleeping habits. While he was talking, Connor's practiced eye caught motion in the forest of firs that bordered the meadow. Shadow sliding over shadow, a glint of eyes. "Is that?" Connor began, pointing. The herders turned, squinting. "Oh no, they're back," said one. The boys whistled, frantically calling to their herd. The caribou started and began to run away from the woods. The shadows emerged from the fir forest. 5 brown wolves. The shaggy, lean beasts ran at the nearest caribou, splitting as if to meet it from all sides. "Briggan!" said Connor, pulling up his sleeve. Pain briefly seared the back of his forearm, and the great grey wolf left passive state and leaped to the ground. "A pack over there! They'll hunt these people's caribou!" Briggan howled. The wolf pack cut short. One held back. Briggan responded. The wolves seemed to consider. Then, with a yip, the pack leader renewed the hunt, the rest following. Briggan growled and ran. His speed both alarmed and thrilled Connor as his wolf cut off the wolf pack before they reached the fleeing caribou. He launched himself at the pack leader, seizing him by the neck, the two rolling through the grass. They separated, both hunched, low and growling, all teeth showing. The rest of the pack was surrounding Briggan now, 5 to 1. Connor began to run closer, his speed enhanced with Briggan in active state. His legs felt strong and long, the grass whipping by as he sped forward, clenching his crook. His heart pounded. But before he reached them, the pack leader stopped growling. He circled as if chasing his tail, head down, nose nearly touching the ground. The submissive posture surprised Connor, coming from the leader of a pack facing just a lone wolf. Then again, that lone wolf was Briggan, one of the 4 fallen. The pack leader howled and retreated to the forest, the pack following. Briggan trotted over to Connor and accepted a hearty neck scratch and much petting. "Good boy, Briggan," said Connor. "Thank you." The herders approached, eyes wide. "A wolf with blue eyes," said one. "He's Briggan, isn't he? The Briggan." Connor nodded, and at last he wasn't the one doing all the talking. The herders had to recount to each other all the Briggan legends they knew. One took Connor by the arm and said, "Come on, old Henna will want to hear about this." Leaving the other with the herd, the young man ran with Connor toward the small gate in the village fence. "Henna, you'll never guess!" the herder shouted at a man standing just inside the gate. "Briggan saved our caribou! The Briggan!" And then he was retelling the whole incident, embellishing the more exciting bits. Henna smiled through the gate's little window. "Briggan, you don't say. But what are you young folks doing up here?" "We need to meet with your lord, or—" Connor looked over the village, considering it too small to have a lord like the Duke in Trunswick. "Do you have a mare? It's really important." Tariq and the others came up behind him then. Henna looked them all over. "Pia doesn't meet with visitors," he said. "We have some gifts for Pia and your village," said Abeka, pulling 2 metal pots and 3 metal knives from her pack. Henna's eyes widened again. Connor noticed the buttons on the herder's jacket were cut from antler, as were the knife in his belt and the buckle itself. Even the hinges on the gate were made of leather. Cut off from traders, this town had a metal shortage. "We also carry news," said Maylin. "We wish to warn your mare and trade information. I think we can be of some help to you, and we will of course be at your service and depart the moment you ask." Henna considered Maylin, the metal gifts in Abeka's hands, and Briggan beside Connor. "Well," Henna began. "Oh, just let them in for a bit," said the herder. "We never have visitors,
And you should have seen what Briggan did. The Briggan.
Henna smiled and opened the gate.
I guess it couldn't hurt this once. Follow me.
Well done, Tariq whispered, just loud enough for Connor to hear.
We don't trade much,
Henna said, leading them up a narrow path.
Our villagers like to keep to themselves, a quiet people.
Loud laughter startled Connor.
Not that quiet,
Roland muttered. They were passing a small park area, abundant with lupines, tulips and buttercups. On a bench built from wood slats and antlers, 3 young women sat, talking and laughing. They were as blonde, tall and athletic-looking as the herders had been. For that matter, so was Henna. For all his talk of young folks, old Henna couldn't have been more than a few years older than the herders. Connor wondered if they were all siblings. A huge, ancient weeping willow bowed over a tiny cemetery. Look, Malin whispered. The stones have names, but not dates. Connor nodded, though he didn't understand what Malin meant. He'd never seen a cemetery before and didn't know why the absence of dates might be strange. The dozens of houses looked nearly identical, long and narrow, grey stones cemented together for the foundation, the rest built from wood and painted red. The roofs were shingled with rough-cut bark, and the chimneys were built from fat and irregular stones. From house to house, the only obvious variations were in the shutters and the doors on their leather hinges, each carved and intricately painted with unique designs of flowers, trees, woodlands, and often a great white polar bear. No road cut through the village, no sign of horses or wagon ruts. Paths were evenly spaced and marked with fine gravel, winding between houses and small parks. The village square was large and open, with a bright green lawn surrounded by stone paths and tulip beds. Connor slowed, walking with the other 3 and letting Tariq and Maya keep pace with Henna. Those carvings are pretty, said Connor, indicating the shutters. I can't imagine shepherds and farmers having time to sit and carve. Back home, we kept busy just to stay fed. These folks seem to have all the time in the world, said Abeka, watching a couple strolling down a lane, holding hands.
Could this be the lost city of chiselling artists? Asked Connor. Lost what? Said Roland. Chiselling who? You know, from that song, said Connor, and he began to sing. Hidden from the ruinous wind, they chiselled a city from snow. It's just a song, said Malin. You think all songs are real? In that case, I'm excited to finally meet the jolly giraffe lump what slurps pigs through its nose. Or remember this one? The giant tooted one horn with his mouth, sang Roland, a second with his other end, and with both blasts he amassed a crowd of admiring friends. I'm unfamiliar with that particular song, Roland, said Abeka. Could you perhaps explain the other end bit? I find it confusing. Well, it's... Roland paused, eyes scanning Abeka's face as if to determine how serious she was. She gave him a faint smile. Anyway, it does look like a village for dolls, Malin interjected. The Emperor's daughter had such toys. Tiny, perfect, painted houses she set up for her tiny, perfect dolls. Exactly. Roland looked around and began to whisper. Even the people look, well, they look like dolls. Apparently, all the children and elderly were indoors, because everyone Connor had seen ranged in age from teenager to early adulthood. The men and women were all tall, with broad shoulders, strong arms, and lovely, perfect faces. Their hair colour ranged from pale brown to gold, and everyone was smiling. Connor shivered, remembering Trunswick, the darkness, the guards with mastiffs, the fear in the streets. Here everything was just the opposite, bright and perfect. And yet,
Samis too felt just a little bit off. Briggan sniffed the air and sneezed. Chapter 4. Pia. Abeka tried to imagine what life would have been like growing up in a place like Samis. So green. Leisure to plant gardens, stroll through parks, carve shutters. Even as a small child, Abeka had felt the crushing weight of need. Need for rain, for meat, for crops to grow. Need to survive. No time for games or parks. And beneath it all, the need to make her father and sister proud. That part still hadn't diminished. She gripped her bow and walked faster.
"Can we meet with your local green cloak?"
Tariq was asking Henna.
Well, we don't have one," said Henna. "Never really needed one."
Never needed one? Even in Abeka's small village they'd had a green cloak. Someone with the nectar. Someone to conduct the bonding ceremony with the children when they turned 11. It didn't matter if a child was in Yora or Nilo or anywhere. If that child was destined to bond with a spirit animal, it would happen, with or without the nectar. But without, the child could get the bonding sickness and risk madness or even death. Abeka thought it unforgivably stupid of these villagers to risk their children by refusing to allow a green cloak in the village. Then again, where were all the children? Henna stopped at a house where a woman was weeding a garden around peas and lettuce.
"Pia, we have some visitors,"
said Henna. Pia stood up slowly. She appeared to be older than everyone else Abeka had seen in Samis, though her fair skin was unwrinkled, her dark blonde hair free of grey. She wore a dark blue dress with a full skirt that stopped just below the knee. It was trimmed with bands of red and topped with a fringed yellow collar. The other villagers wore similar outfits cut from the same blue and red clothes, the same felt boots with curled-up toes, but only Pia wore the yellow collar. Abeka guessed it was some sign of her rank, like the epaulets on the shoulders of military leaders, or even her own green cloak. "I see you've come a long way," said Pia, "but I'm sorry. Samis doesn't entertain visitors."
"That boy there has bonded with Briggan," said Henna. "He drove off the wolf pack that's been harassing the herd, and the Nilo girl brought us metal."
Abeka handed Pia the pots and knives. Pia looked over them, as if at all the gold of Zhong, hefting them in her hands. This is very kind. Thank you." Pia smiled. And with that simple gesture, Abeka didn't feel worried anymore. The strangeness of the town, the long journey, and the strained welcome all faded for her in the power of one genuine smile. Something in Abeka warned that she shouldn't be quite so trusting, but she just didn't believe bright smiles could hide dark hearts.
"If we could just speak with you a moment,"
said Tariq. Pia pressed her lips together, but the smile returned, and she gestured them inside. The little parlour of her house was neat and clean. Wood benches were topped with leather cushions. A carved table showed tiny animals whittled from bone. Several sets of caribou antlers hung on the walls, their tips filed down and fit with candles. Under their feet was a rug of woven fir roots. They sat, and Meilin spoke first, as if she'd been holding in words she couldn't bear to keep quiet any longer. "Zhong has fallen," she said. Pia inhaled sharply.
"A new devourer has risen, calling vast armies to his terrible cause,"
said Tariq.
"If Zhong has fallen to the conquerors, Yora won't be far behind. If Yora falls, Samis will fall with it."
"You came all this way to warn us? There are no soldiers here to help in your war," said Pia. "We are too small to—"
"We're looking for Suka,"
said Tariq. There was a brief pause. and Pia turned so still and thoughtful that she seemed to have fallen asleep with her eyes open.
"She's a giant polar bear," Roland prodded. "You know, from the stories that mention this village that you are living in right now." "No, nothing."
Pia's eyes darted to Roland and back to Tariq, and then she laughed. "Suka! Well, she's not here at the moment, but I expect her to stop by for supper any minute." Pia laughed again. An expression of measured disappointment clouded Tariq's face. Rebecca hoped it wasn't a sign of bad things to come.
"Greencloak scholars uncovered several legends that say Suka showed favour to your town," said Tariq. "Supposedly the last place she was seen was here in Samis."
"Yes, I've heard the legends," said Pia. "But legends are old, and if great Suka used to favour our town, she hasn't been to Samis in many, many lifetimes."
"She used to drink from a pond here," said Tariq. "May we see it?"
Pia hesitated, but then that wide smile returned. "Of course. It is sacred to us, so I'll ask you not to touch the waters. Follow me." At the very north end of the village grew 2 ancient willows, their branches sheltering a pond. Perhaps the pond was natural, but people had placed stones around it, even lining the pond's bottom with smooth, flat rocks. The water was so clear Rebecca could see the stones easily through 5 or 10 feet of water. The surface rippled as if stirred by a breeze, though Rebecca felt nothing. "This is Suka's pond," said Pia. Legend says she used to come here once a year and drink."
"How could Suka get here when the village is walled in?" asked Roland.
"You think that a little wall would slow down a great beast?" asked Pia. "Besides, this was long ago, before the wall surrounding Samis was built." She gestured to a carving of an upright polar bear, cut from a jagged white rock. "We honour her with this memorial, but of course we have no idea where Suka has been hiding all these years."
"It seems weird to me that you would flat out lie to us like that," said Roland.
Pia started, then smoothed her features. "Roland," Rebecca whispered. Maybe he'd never learned to respect his elders. If Rebecca had dared talk like that to her father, she'd get switch-whipped. "That's an impertinent thing to say, young man," Pia said.
Roland shrugged. "Sorry, still true. You're hiding something."
Essex wasn't perched on Roland's shoulder. Could Pia's lies be clear enough that Roland could detect them, even without his gerfalcon in direct contact? Or perhaps his spirit-animal-enhanced intuition was getting stronger. "You say Suka came before the wall was built," said Maylin. "Yet the layers of reindeer moss growing on the wood shows the wall's age, going back to even before the time of the Devourer, perhaps."
"I had a dream last night," said Connor. "I thought it was just a dream, not a dream. You know what I mean?"
Rebecca nodded. Since bonding with Briggan, Connor sometimes had prophetic dreams.
"But I recognized this pond from my dream," Connor continued. "A group of elderly people was staggering along toward it, and their faces were eager."
Pia's pale face turned even paler. Rebecca had kept Uraza in passive state up till now, so as not to seem hostile, but she needed her leopard's aid now. She reached a hand slowly toward the pond, palm up, almost as if the waters were a wayward puppy she was about to call toward her. In a quick motion, she brought her fingers into a fist, and Uraza flashed into existence. Pia stumbled back a step, stunned at the appearance of yet another great beast, even though, like Briggan, Uraza was the size of a normal leopard. Uraza padded toward the pond as if to drink. "No one drinks from this water, neither human nor beast, be it great or common," said Pia. "It is sacred." The leopard sniffed at the water and recoiled, looking back at Abeka, communicating that something was wrong.
"Don't worry, she doesn't want to."
Abeka sat at the water's edge with a hand on Uraza, in part to reassure Pia, but also to feel some of the clarity of thought that came with their bond. There were pieces of something here, a fractured story that could fit together like the gazelle antler puzzles that Chinwe, her village's greencloak, used to carve. Abeka had always been good at those. Rain dancer. Chinwe had declared Abeka the new rain dancer for the village, but her bond with a great beast had forced her to leave. Now she allowed herself to soak in that title, to feel community with the water before her, sense it as she would the presence of a friend standing near, her hand stroking Uraza's neck. She was dimly aware of the conversation continuing without her, Tariq and Pia and Roland speaking in turn. But Abeka pointed her thoughts instead to the water, to Pia, to the people of Samis. No children, no elders, Connor's dream, the gate and wall, old Henna. All the pieces of this puzzle were snapping together in Abeka's mind. She knew this story. In Nilo, the legend was of a tree whose fruit would keep you young forever, and two villages that destroyed each other and the tree itself while trying to possess it. A tense pause in the conversation seemed to vibrate the air around her, and she stood.
"You know," Abeka said, "it's interesting that there are no children or elderly in your village, Pia. And there's something different about this water that Suka used to drink. Uraza can smell it. And Connor's dream about elderly people hurrying toward the pond. I'm thinking that you're much older than you look, Pia. I'm thinking old Henna might actually be old. You all are. And that has something to do with Suka's pond."
Roland looked at the water, taking a step back.
"That's unnatural." "You can't think," Pia began.
"Perhaps we should all drink from the pond," said Tariq, "just to check Abeka's idea."
"Ooh, what do you think, Teeny?"
Maya asked her salamander, holding him in her palm.
"Do you want to live forever and ever and ever?"
"No, wait," Pia sighed, sitting on a rock beside the pond. She looked at each one of them in turn, directly in the eyes, as if checking for something. She sighed again. "Very well. Suka did come to this pond and drink, every year on New Year's Day. The villagers have always avoided the place, believing the event was sacred. When I was young, my mother told me that as long as we kept the waters clear for Suka, we would be under her protection. But I was always curious. I wanted to see the great polar bear for myself. So when I became mayor, I built my house near her pond, and I watched her, year after year." Pia's eyes became unfocused, as if watching a memory. "She was huge and terrifying, but you've never seen anything so beautiful. It was as if the moon itself had dipped down to drink from our waters. Suka didn't seem to mind my company. I kept quiet, just watched her until she'd sated herself and ambled away. Nearly 3 decades passed that way, she and I and our little ritual. Then, one year, she simply didn't come. I went to the pond, I watched and waited, but Suka never arrived. It felt wrong, a breaking of a tradition. So early that morning, just before the sunrise, I crouched down and drank from the pond myself, to complete the new year." Pia paused.
"The water's changed you,"
said Tariq. Pia nodded. A stillness came over me. I seemed to feel the bones of my skeleton as if they burned, and the gentle heat worked through my muscles, my skin. I was a grandmother at that time, but I seemed to get younger. Ever since, these waters have kept us young. Some chose not to take the water and lived a normal lifespan. Others grew tired of their long lives and stopped drinking. They aged within a few years and then died peacefully. Those who drink never have children, and all who remain in Samis today have drunk. We are the last of our clan.
You think Suka drank from here for the same purpose? Asked Maylin.
Pia shook her head. The water here used to be pale brown like the river nearby, but the longer Suka stayed away, the more clear, crystal, nearly blue it became. I heard rumours years ago come down from Arctica that Suka had frozen herself and her talisman deep within the ice. I believe that with her powers in suspension, her tie to this pond is granting it life-giving magic. If you find Suka and wake her, the powers of the water might go away. Then all of Samis would dwindle and die.
It's a terrible risk, said Tariq, but the future will be even more terrible if the Devourer wins. We need to find her.
It doesn't matter. I know nothing that would help you. She glanced uneasily at Rolan and then away. You may stay the night, and then you must go. We have no inn, so you'll need to sleep in the stable. Visitors might discover the secret of the pond, as you have. If the secret gets out, people would come from all over. Wars would be raged over its waters.
Of course, said Tariq. We swear to keep your secret.
Abeka mumbled affirmation.
Connor and Maylin both intoned, I so swear, at exactly the same time, startling each other a little.
I can keep a secret, Maya said.
What secret?
Roland said. Pia raised an eyebrow and then nodded. She didn't seem consoled. Pia gave them dinner at her house, thinly sliced caribou meat on flatbread with onions and turnips. The meal was close enough to one Abeka had often shared with her family that she desperately wished for the burning tang of a Bhut Jolokia pepper or one of the dried grass spices of Nilo. She lowered her emotions like a blade, trying to cut off all longing. Just yearning for the food of home had cracked open her heart, reminding her of her father's hands as he sanded sticks for arrows, of her sister's voice singing as she cooked. She missed them more than peppers and spices, but a twinge in her heart reminded her that they probably didn't miss her. She closed her eyes, sealing the cracks inside, refocusing on Abeka in northern Yura, Abeka the Greencloak, Abeka who might never return home again. Uraza pressed her large head under Abeka's hand, rubbing against her palm. Abeka lowered her plate, letting the leopard finish up the caribou meat. As they settled into the fresh grass strewn on the stable floor, Tariq spoke of travelling north tomorrow and trying their luck exploring Arctica on their own.
Connor, perhaps you could have a perfectly timed prophetic dream tonight telling us where to go, said Abeka.
I'll do my best, said Connor. He smiled.
So we're just rolling with the whole Suka froze herself thing?
Roland said.
I admit that Pia didn't seem like she was lying about that, but you guys are all like, yeah, sure, that sounds about right.
It does sound about right, Connor said, tossing a stick down the long, narrow barn for Briggan to fetch.
But it's weird. Does no one else think that is weird?
Roland looked around the group.
That a bear would freeze herself? How would you even do that?
I know a dozen ways at least, Maylin said. Wise men and women in Zhong freeze themselves regularly.
What?
Roland sputtered.
It is much more comfortable to pass the sweltering summers encased in ice, Maylin said.
Pfft!
Roland snorted, throwing up his arms. Maylin smiled slightly, though Abeka noticed that the smile quickly disappeared.
And here I thought you were able to tell when people were lying, Connor muttered, smirking. Whatever. In any case, Pia knows more about all this, said Roland. I still think she could help us.
But we can't force her to, said Tariq.
I could burn down her house or something, said Maya through a yawn.
Abeka sat up, staring. Maya laughed. Kidding, kidding! She settled into the grass cuttings and muttered, I mean, I could burn down her house, but I won't. Teeny and I don't like hurting anybody, do we, Teeny? No, we don't, you adorable little sticky-footed genius. Abeka woke in the morning to Araza sneezing on bits of hay. She lay stretched out beside Abeka, her body longer than Abeka was tall. Abeka idly stroked her belly and heard Araza purr. The earth tremor of her purr would be enough to wake up the others. Sudden noises came in through the window. Shouts. Anger. Sounds that didn't belong in the perfect doll village of Samis. By the time Abeka was on her feet, the others were awake and rising. They hurried out to the village centre. First she noticed a hole in the wall. Something had punched through the logs, leaving a gaping hole large enough for a person to climb through. And it appeared some persons had in fact climbed through. "Shane!" said Abeka. A group of 5 conquerors stood before the hole, but Abeka's eyes didn't stray from Shane. Blonde, broad, his arms and face tanned from the Zhong sun. The sight of his smile awoke 1,000 memories. Their hours together training, laughing, whispering stories, standing at the ship's bow with the spray on their lips, the wind against their faces, feeling as if the whole world could be theirs. Until Shane, Abeka had never known how it felt to be with someone who liked her, who respected her, who even wanted her around. Abeka could feel her companions around her bristling, hear them pull out weapons, but she walked over to Shane to shake his hand. He surprised her by meeting her halfway, his arms open. He gave her a warm hug. "I missed you, Abeka," he whispered into her hair. "I'm so glad you're here." Abeka shut her eyes, feeling the sting of tears. "Back off!" Connor yelled. He pulled Abeka away and faced Shane, holding his crook, Brigand tense by his side. "Touch Abeka again, and I'll knock you flat on your stink-stained conqueror behind." Maylin was beside Connor, and she didn't waste time with words. She came forward, hands in fists. A tall Zhongese man stepped smoothly in front of Shane, and when Maylin struck, the man defended. She delivered a series of blows that the man blocked with his arms, finally striking her with the palm of his hand. She stumbled back. Maylin released G. The panda sat calmly behind her, investigating the grass, looking entirely unthreatening. But Maylin smiled, lifted her fists, and said to the man, "Let's try that again." "No, Maylin, Connor, stop," said Abeka. She and Araza put themselves in front of Shane. "We didn't come to fight," said Shane. "Please, we just want to talk." "Breaking our wall is not talking behaviour," Old Henna called out. "I apologise for that," said Shane. "My companions were over-eager when you didn't open the gate for us. I'll fix it with my own hands, I swear." "I'll fix you with my own hands," Maylin said through clenched teeth. Abeka and Araza didn't move. "So much has happened. So many deaths on both our sides," said Shane, his voice warm, melting like butter over hot bread. "Before anyone else dies, let's talk, please." Abeka looked over Shane's companions now. Besides the Zhongese man, the 2 impostors they'd last seen in Trunswick flanked him. The pale-haired Talia held her toad in both hands, like an ugly ball she was ready to throw in some horrible game to which only she knew the rules. Anna was 1 step behind her, crouched next to her Gila monster. She stroked it as one might pet a cat, but her dark eyes were locked on the green cloaks, peering hatefully between 2 curtains of straight, night-black hair. To Shane's other side were 2 larger warrior-type men, one atop an ox, the other with a brown-eyed lynx weaving between his ankles. They looked vaguely familiar, as if Abeka had seen their faces among the ranks of the conquerors before. But the Amayan woman beside them was a stranger. She had pale brown skin, dark eyes, and long straight black hair. Her long travel dress was dark purple, embroidered with yellow and white along the sleeves and hem. On her shoulder sat a grave-looking raven. But what most caught Abeka's eye was a striking sadness in the woman's beautiful face.
"So, talk," said Tariq. "We're listening."
"Tariq?" Maylin growled. Her knees were slightly bent, her hands in tight fists. "We know what they want and what they'll do to get it. Let's take them now."
"Maylin," said Tariq. "Come here, please."
Maylin hesitated, but complied. Abeka joined her group, and the 6 of them huddled to talk quietly, Uraza and Brigand standing like sentries between them and the conquerors, teeth bared. Maylin and Connor glared at Abeka. She expected the same look of anger or mistrust from Roland too, but he was strangely distracted, just staring over his shoulder at the conquerors.
"We can't leave now," said Tariq. "While we wander north in search of Suka, Shane and his crew might persuade or bully the information out of Pia and beat us to the talisman."
"So we fight," said Maylin.
"I'm not confident we could beat that crew," said Tariq.
"I could beat Shane," said Connor. "I have no doubt. I dreamed about it."
"A prophetic dream?"
Tariq asked.
Connor fidgeted. "Figure of speech," he said. "Not like a nighttime dream, like a detailed mental exercise."
"You mean you daydreamed it," said Maylin. "You imagined punching his face in over and over again."
"Pretty much," said Connor. "Yeah, I've had that daydream too,"
Roland muttered. "Shane means no harm, I swear," said Abeka. "Look, he doesn't have his Wolverine out. He almost always keeps his spirit animal in passive state when he meets us. A true sign that he doesn't want to fight." "No harm," said Maylin, eyes burning with rage. "This is the agent of the very being responsible for the destruction of my home and the death of my father. I count those things as great, unforgivable harm." Abeka closed her eyes and then opened them slowly. "And that is terrible, unjust, and not easily forgiven. But also not Shane. He's different. He truly believes he's on the side of right, just as I did." "He is the enemy," said Maylin, as if talking to a small child. "I know he works for the enemy," said Abeka, "but I believe that one day he might be able to see the Devourer for what he is." "So your secret hope is that Shane will abandon everything he stands for and change his entire worldview?" asked Maylin. "It is possible. After all, I did." "Yes, and seeing you embrace the Devourer's errand boy has shown me just how deep your conversion runs." Abeka winced.
"Enough,"
said Tariq, the beginnings of a frown creasing an already stern expression.
"We will not let them tear this team apart. First, we will listen, and then—"
There was a sudden blunt cracking sound, as of a fresh kill being struck by a hammer. Abeka looked up quickly to see Shane on one knee, nose bleeding. Maylin stood in a fighting pose several paces away, seemingly too far away to have accomplished such a feat. But Abeka had seen how fast Maylin could move. "Maylin, no!" Abeka shouted. For a moment, Abeka was again at the Battle of Dinesh's temple, knee-deep in water, the air so humid it seemed to push into every pore and try to crawl down her throat. Conquerors swarming at them like ants over fallen bread. An enemy soldier chopping at her, his sword stopped short by Shane's curved saber. Saved by this boy who was supposed to be her enemy. And now he stood there, his nose bleeding from Maylin's fist. The rest of Shane's group was variously standing, shouting, or drawing steel.
"Come on," shouted Mei Lin. "You are due much more than a mere taste of your own blood, so I will do my best to serve up a feast."
The ox charged Mei Lin, and she leaped, pushing off of its advancing skull even as the head reared up. She vaulted faster than seemed possible to Abeka's eyes, doing a full turn in mid-air and landing, heel first, in the face of the man who had, until recently, been riding the ox.
"Enough!"
shouted several voices, but none was the owner of the maddened ox, so it spun, frothing at the mouth, and renewed the charge. Mei Lin readied herself to dodge the oncoming beast, but Abeka saw Ji amble into the charging animal's path.
"Ji!"
Mei Lin yelled, her stance breaking. Ji turned her passive, silver-eyed stare to Mei Lin, and then, the instant before impact, Ji simply looked at the charging animal. Abeka's jaw dropped as the ox, instead of barreling into the panda, skidded to a halt, knelt, and began to lick Ji's paw.
"Enough!"
Pia called out again. Abeka realized the other voices calling enough had been Tariq and Shane. Pia had arrived in the town square, that same smile plastered to her face despite what had just happened. Abeka began to question the sincerity of the smile.
"There is no fighting in Samis,"
Pia announced.
"Pia,"
said Tariq, placing a calming hand on Mei Lin's shoulder.
"You have more visitors, as I expected. If you speak to Shane here, I want to be present as well."
She nodded and walked away. Tariq and Shane followed. Abeka hoped Shane would look back, so she could mouth that she was sorry, or smile encouragingly or something. But his head was bowed, his hand holding a rag to his bleeding nose.
"Abeka, Connor, keep an eye on—"
Tariq nodded toward Talia and Anna, the two brutes, and the mysterious woman.
"And on Mei Lin,"
he added. Abeka nodded. She had every confidence her big cat could take down any of the other spirit animals. And after this business with Mei Lin, her own heart was thrumming, her muscles tense, all of her wishing for a fight. But fight whom? Shane's friends? Mei Lin? Maybe her own self. She put a hand on Uraza's head and took a deep breath. She would try to keep the peace, for Shane's sake.
Chapter 5.
Adana. Essex was gone. Everyone stood in the village square, bristling with weapons and spirit animals, and Roland felt so bare he might as well be naked. That was why his hands were shaking. That was why his mouth was dry, and why he'd refused to look at the woman with the raven. He wouldn't admit to himself any other reason. When no one was looking his way, he slipped behind a house and began to circle the inner ring of the town's fence.
"Essex,"
he hissed.
"Please, Essex, come on."
He couldn't really blame her. Sticking around where people expected you to be led only to trouble. He'd learned the hard way on the streets of Concorba. Keep moving. You stay in one place, the bullies find you, beat you up, steal the scrap of blanket and heel of bread you've been hoarding, almost kill you. Roland got it. He just wished Essex would hang around every once in a while, bolster his reputation a bit as a fierce warrior with a faithful spirit animal in tow. On the streets, if you looked harmless, you ate dirt.
"Essex,"
he whispered again. His voice shook, still addled by the encounter with Shane, and who he'd brought with him. It wasn't possible. He knew it wasn't possible. But she'd looked so much like... He shook his head, angry at himself for getting rattled by a familiar-looking face. Roland crept behind one of the ridiculously adorable houses with its perfectly carved and painted shutters. When he heard footsteps coming from the other direction, he expected to see one of those tall, muscular, golden-haired beauties that passed as villagers around here. but it was her. The woman's hair was as black as her raven's wings, straight and thick, falling down to her waist. Her eyes were dark and large, her skin the brown of the best kinds of bread, her face broad. His breath got tangled in his chest. Something is beautiful, he'd come to understand, if you want to look at it. And her face had for many years been the most beautiful thing in the world to him. And for years after, her face was the image he couldn't help looking for among the crowds of Concorba. Every day, all the time, for years and years, though his heart hurt at the pointlessness of it. He'd finally given up years ago, well and truly given up looking for her, wondering about her, hoping for her. She was dead. He'd been so sure. Now, here, across an ocean, and in a strange little village near the top of the world, to see that face again. Not her, can't be her, he told himself. But her hands raised, and he noticed they were shaking. She seemed to reach for him before hesitating, dropping again. She looked behind her and back again. Her eyes were wide, as if she couldn't look at him hard enough. "Roland," she whispered, "is it really you?" He nodded. His head was giddy. His legs felt comically shaky like sacks of sand. "Roland," she said again. Then she began to cry. She sat on a stone, and he took the excuse to sit, too, unsure if he could keep his feet. He could feel the warmth of her arm so near his own, and the realness of her shocked him. This was not some little boy's desperate daydream. She was here. "My name is Adana, but I think you know who I am?" she asked. He nodded, feeling dumb. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry. You know that, right? You know I wouldn't have left you if I could have. If I didn't love you enough to leave." She hadn't wiped her tears, just left them to run down her cheeks, letting nothing get in the way of looking at him. Roland felt his heart ice. Once, back in Concorba, he'd come across a girl alone, sitting on the street, crying loudly. Everyone else ignored her, but he'd gone closer to see if he could help. That was when the rest of her crew had jumped out, struck him in the head, and stolen the 2 coins he'd earned after a day of begging. When the girl had run off, her crying had changed to laughter. Instinctively, Roland looked around, expecting the attack. No one jumped out. "Can I know nothing will make up for all you might have suffered, but will you allow me to explain?" Adana asked. He nodded again, because he really couldn't think of anything else to do. She took a deep breath, and then the words poured out as if she'd been holding them in for a long time. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want to leave you. You believe me? I had no father, no family besides a mother who lived with a bottle in her hand. I turned 11 and never had a nectar ceremony. When I was 14, Wicarus came to me." She nodded toward her raven, who was perched above them on the branch of a tree. "We bonded without nectar. I felt," she pressed her hands against her head, "like I'd been ripped apart. My head, my gut, it was so painful. I think I spent days in a fever, and when I became aware again, my mother had gone, but Wicarus stayed. He always stays." The raven turned his head, staring at Roland with one round eye. "I survived as best I could, battling the bonding sickness. I wasn't well, and by the time I became pregnant with you, Roland, I tried." Her voice cracked. "You were so perfect, such a perfect baby. And at times when I was holding you,
I felt almost normal. But other times...
Her eyes went dark. The only image Roland carried with him from his early childhood was her face, her beautiful face, as if it had been carved in a cameo and worn against his heart. But as she spoke, he had flashes. Her face in a rage, screaming. A bottle thrown into an alley, the explosion of glass, shards flying, cutting into his cheeks. His mother flailing, punching at bricks, while he huddled on a step, frightened. Wandering down a street, alone and cold, searching, and then finding her asleep on the stones. And then curling up tight beside her, to keep her warm, to keep himself warm, to assure himself she would stay close this time.
Some days I wasn't sure who I was, who you were, she said. One time you woke me, crying in the night. We were sleeping high up in the attic of an abandoned building, and in delirium I thought you were a rat attacking me. I grabbed you and I almost... Her breath shuddered. After that, I knew I had to get you away from me before I did something horrible. So I took you to a big house near the centre of town. I'd watched that family for some time. They had lots of children, and at night the windows were always bright, as if they had plenty of money for candles. So I figured they could afford to keep you, maybe even love you.
Roland wasn't sure what house she meant. He had no memory of the place. Adana swiped quickly at her tears while she talked.
First I washed your face, and your hands, and your tiny little feet. You didn't have shoes, but I wanted you to have clean feet, so your new family would know you were a good boy. And then I kissed your cheeks, and told you to be good and stay put till the nice family came for you. And I knocked on their door, and I ran.
Roland didn't realise he'd been crying till he felt a line of cold pull down his cheek. He touched it, and his fingertips came back wet.
I waited across the street till I saw someone open the door. I knew they'd take you in and take care of you. You were such a smart little boy, I felt sure they'd see that. So I fled, and I don't remember a lot of the next years. I wasn't always in my right mind. But I survived, somehow. Wicarus could steal fruit from trees and bread cooling on windows. Even when I got really bad, Wicarus never left me. Though he bit me sometimes, clawed at me. He had the bonding sickness too.
She brushed her fingers unconsciously across her cheek, and Roland noticed a series of pale scars. He thumbed a clash of old scars on his wrist and wondered if Wicarus had caused those as well.
I think I was dead, or nearly, when Zarif found me. He gave me the bile to drink, and slowly the darkness left my mind. The bile cured both of us of that awful sickness. He saved us, Roland. He saved me and Wicarus. I owe him everything. So, of course, I serve him now, serve both him and the Reptile King. He isn't the devourer you think he is. They're out in the world, looking for people like me, who the Green Cloaks didn't bother finding, didn't bother helping, curse them.
She looked Roland over, as if noticing that he wasn't wearing a green cloak, and she smiled approvingly. Her smile faltered.
Roland, I wish you'd say something, she whispered.
Roland licked his lips, trying to work moisture into his mouth. He said, "Ma." His voice was a dry whisper. She grabbed his hands, rubbing them as if to warm him up. The gesture was achingly familiar. He was afraid to ask, but did.
"Once you were well, did you look for me?"
"Yes," she said, clearly relieved to say it. "Yes, I did. I went back to that house, but it had been sold and the new owners didn't know where the others had moved. I hoped your new family was living in the country now, with animals, perhaps, and clean air and lots of fresh food. Did you move to the country?"
What could he tell her? She'd seen someone open that door, but she'd left before seeing them shut it again in the face of a ragged little boy. He wondered how long he must have stayed on the doorstep of the big house, waiting for a family to come for him, like she'd said. He wondered how long he'd wandered the streets looking for her, before giving up and finding a hole to sleep in alone. Should he describe to her the long years of starvation and fear, abandonment, loneliness, of his doing almost anything just to survive, and dreaming of a mother who'd held his head to her chest and let him fall asleep against her heartbeat? Or should he tell a kind lie to put her at peace? He hadn't yet decided when her raven squawked, a jarring, unnaturally loud sound. Wickerus batted his wings and took to the air as Essex came swooping down. Essex shrieked at the raven. The two birds met mid-air, feet forward, and clawed at each other.
"No," said Adana. "Leave him alone."
"Essex!" Roland cried. The gerfalcon flew past Roland and returned again, shrieking as she tried to seize the raven with her talons. The raven fought back, croaking hideously. "Essex, don't hurt him!" Essex spun, taking again to the skies, as if to get as far away from Wickerus as possible.
"Essex?" said Adana, blinking rapidly. "Of course. You were one of the children bonded to the Four Fallen."
"I'm sorry," said Roland. "I don't know why she attacked."
"It's okay. Wickerus isn't hurt."
Adana took Roland's hand in both of her own, pressing it with warmth.
"I don't want anything to detract attention from our reunion."
Roland smiled and wanted to be okay, but he felt uneasy. Essex had warned him all those months ago to flee from Zarif. Her instincts had been right then and dozens of times since, and the memory of Zarif and of the conquerors killing Maylin's father was still as fresh as a bleeding wound. He almost leaned in then, ducking his head under her chin as if he were still a little boy, to let her embrace him. But crammed into those few inches between them, he felt the years of solitude on the streets, the conqueror's trail of death, and even a fight between a raven and a falcon.
I should go check with my, team,"
he stammered, and turned and left before he could change his mind. As he walked away, he felt a raw pang in his chest, as if a chunk of his heart had torn off. Roland walked, but his heart just beat harder. He felt jittery, his blood fast, his body anxious for action. He wanted to find someone he could blame for all this pain and hit him. Instead, he ran. He skirted the houses, running beside the fence, working his body hard. He came upon Pia's house and slowed. Voices drifted from her open window. He slowed his breathing, and then crept closer, stooping below the window.
"Say what you will to Pia, Shane, but don't be a fool and expect me to believe your lies."
Tariq was shouting. Shouting! In anger, no less. He never did that. The Battle of Dinesh's temple must still be haunting Tariq too.
"Tariq, please," said Shane, calm even in the face of Tariq's rage. "Don't worry about this. You know only I can keep Pia and her town safe."
Roland heard footsteps on the gravel walk and started away from the window. It was Pia, carrying a pitcher toward the well. Inside, Tariq and Shane continued to argue. "Overhear anything interesting?" Pia asked, lowering the bucket into the water. She looked tired, her near-constant smile unable to hide the sadness.
"Pia, listen. I'm not a green cloak, and I'm not a fan of meddling in others' affairs. I think people should mostly just mind their own business. But I've seen what Shane and his allies do. They have no mercy. They kill anyone who gets in their way.
And what is their way? Pia asked calmly, pouring water into the pitcher.
Destruction, he said. Domination. No place is safe. If Shane is already here, the army of conquerors won't be far behind. There's no use hiding from them. Nowhere is safe, and nothing will remain the same. Zhong has fallen. They're all over Nilo and Yura. Please, helping us isn't a choice between keeping your extended life and losing it. It's a choice between any life at all and total destruction.
Pia nodded. This didn't seem to surprise her, and Roland suddenly wondered if she was old enough to remember the war with the first devourer.
You know how to help us find Suka, he said. Please, someone's going to find her, wake her, claim her talisman. If it's not us, it will be the conquerors.
Pia pressed her lips together. She looked out over the town, as if seeing it for the last time. Something in her face made him think she was about to lie to him. But the heightened sounds of Tariq and Shane came through the window, and Pia sighed. "Excuse me, I should return to my guests," she said. She started back to the house. Essex screeched, circling overhead, and in that moment, Roland noticed Pia's hand straying to her apron pocket, as if making sure something there lay hidden. Roland rushed after her, catching her just inside the small kitchen.
"What are you hiding?"
he asked, indicating her apron pocket.
"What do you have?"
She was still smiling, yet somehow it looked more like a frown. Her hand went into her pocket, and he could see the indecision on her face. "I was going to give this to one of you, and I think you and your friends have a better chance of finding Suka than the newcomers." Truth? She meant what she said. A squawk startled Roland, Essex shouting a warning. He turned to see Wickerus flying past the open kitchen door and flapping over to Adana, who was emerging through a small copse of trees. "Roland!" Adana called out, just as Pia dropped something heavy into Roland's inner cloak pocket before hurrying back into the main room. Roland was addled by the presence of his mother, and he didn't think to examine Pia's face before she was already gone. He opened his pocket and peered in. A compass. Why would Pia give him a compass? He shuffled back outside. The sharp light of morning sun sliced at his eyes, and he blinked rapidly. "Roland, are you all right?" Adana asked, coming nearer. "You ran off." Must be a family trait, he thought. But now she was here, his mother, alive, real. That face from his dreams wasn't just the vain imagination of a pathetic, lonely orphan boy. And his heart ached where that chunk had torn free. "I'm sorry," she said. And he believed her. She was sorry. Everything she'd said had been true. She'd been sick, mad, trying to protect him. And now she'd found him again. So why did he hurt so much more now than when he'd believed her long dead? "Stay with me," she said. "Please." Words of affirmation rose in his throat. He choked them down, glancing at the house where Tariq's and Shane's voices lashed out the window. "Shane is good," said Adana. "I swear it. I've seen so much good that he does."
"I've seen other things," said Roland.
"He is passionate about protecting the world from the duplicitous Greencloaks. They hoard the secret of the nectar. They subject us all to their secret plans." He didn't want to argue with her, but the words came out pleading.
"We don't need the Greencloaks or the Conquerors."
She shook her head. "Zarif saved my life, Roland. I won't abandon his cause. Abandoning you was hard enough. I won't do that again, not to anyone I care about." Besides, with the bile, we're saving hundreds more from the bonding sickness. The Reptile King is turning the tide of power all over Erdas. Come join us. Be a part of the new world. She held out her hands, as if yearning for him. Essex wasn't there to disapprove. So Roland stumbled forward and almost fell against her. Her arms wrapped around him, warm and wonderful. He didn't lift his own, just let himself be held. He felt her cheek lay against the top of his head, her heartbeat steady against his chin. Part of him felt safe and whole for the first time in his life, and another part ached beyond belief.